Good morning, everybody. For those in the room, of those online, my name's Troy. I'm the pastor here. If this is your first time connecting in with us, I want to start off by just asking, if I was to speak to somebody who knows you better than anybody else, and I was to ask them, how much do you complain? What would their response be? Would they say, you complain all the time about just about everything? Usually first world problems, but you complain about everything. Or would they say that you're somebody who doesn't complain at all? Or maybe they say that you're somewhere in between. That's a great conversation starter, by the way. If you're going out for a nice, for those who are married, if you're not going out for a nice romantic dinner, and you go, what is the topic of conversation this evening? Well, I've got one for you. Tell me how much I complain. That'll go down really well. That sets a tone for a very nice romantic evening, I would imagine. But in the complaints that you make, how often do you complain about how hard it is to be a Christian these days? How often do you complain it's becoming so hard to be a Christian in today's world? And just as you think about that response, let your response be tempered with the knowledge that there are Christian brothers and sisters throughout the world where it's illegal to go to church, to do what we're doing today. It's illegal to even own a Bible. It's illegal even to say the name Jesus, to be a Christian. So as you contemplate about how hard it is to be a Christian in the world today, make sure you keep that as your perspective about the wider experiences of brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. But if you do think it's becoming harder to being a Christian in the world today, tell me, how is it becoming harder for you? Seriously, how is becoming a Christian harder for you? Is it becoming harder to be a Christian publicly for you, where we are scared to show our faith in Jesus for fear of what might happen to us? I mean, we've seen what's played out in the media in the last few weeks with a guy called Andrew Thornburn, who was the ex-CEO of the AFL club Essendon. And he was horribly treated professionally, as you may remember. And he was abused publicly. And we think, there we go, Troy, there's Exhibit A on how it's becoming harder to become a Christian these days, how to be a Christian in the world today. And remember that we think that it's harder because this Andrew Thornburn guy, he lost his job after being in the role for one day simply based on what he believed. Not on anything he did in the role, but what he believed, because what was said was, oh no, Mr. Thornburn, your traditional Christian views on abortion and sexuality, that's not consistent with the values of the AFL club. So out you go. Would it be true to say that you feel like the world seems to be putting an extraordinary amount of pressure upon you as a Christian, and putting an extraordinary pressure upon what you believe, saying that your beliefs are unacceptable, that they are even offensive and appalling, that you are not to have those beliefs? Society today will say, you are to have beliefs, but let me tell you what you are to believe. And if anybody believes anything different to that, then those beliefs are to be rejected. Those beliefs are to be rejected, and those who hold them are to be rejected. There's been a dramatic change that more than a few of us are appreciating right now. And it's like we're going, I don't even recognise the world that we're living in anymore. I just don't know what's going on in the world, because the stuff that's happening to us in this world today, to Christians, just seems so foreign to us, so foreign to me. It's like we're living in a foreign country now. You know, it's quite timely then that we are now starting a series where we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Daniel. Because in this story we see how some people of faith also dealt with a dramatic change in their world, and how there was incredible, extraordinary amount of pressure upon what they too also held dear. You know, there's so many similarities between our story and that of the story in Daniel. But what we know in from having a look at the Daniel story and what continues today is that God doesn't want you to be a person of little faith or not even mediocre faith. God, in fact, wants you to be a person of bold faith because of what Jesus has done. Because of what Jesus has done, he is then calling us, compelling us to be people of bold faith. And this bold faith is epitomised by Daniel and his three mates that we'll look at in this book. And that's where we get the title for our series, Bold Faith. So just to let you know about where we're going to be going over the next few weeks as we look at this book in greater depth, we're going to be looking at just some of the key moments that display a boldness of faith in God in a society which is at best ignorant of God or at worst disregarding and straight out opposing God. So this is what we're going to be looking at through the chapters of Daniel. We're going to be looking at the dream. Next week, we're going to be looking at the dream, which is looking at Daniel chapter 2. The king's dream of a statue made of different material and the faith that it took Daniel to speak to power about the meaning of that dream. Then we're going to be looking at the furnace, which is Daniel chapter 3. Daniel's three mates being thrown into a fiery furnace because of their faith stand for God. Then we're going to be looking at the very familiar story to many of us, and that is about the den, which is in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel himself being thrown into a lion's den because of his faith stand for God. But today we're going to be starting off by looking at the challenge that we find in Daniel chapter 1. So let's get into it and have a little bit more of a look at it. This may be a story that is familiar to many of us for years of reading this story, or this may be something brand new, but I hope that you may have or even had time to pre-read Daniel chapter 1 so you know what we're going to be looking at today. And you might want to pre-read each of these chapters every week so you know what we're going to be looking at. But this is how the story starts in the book of Daniel. So from verse 1 of chapter 1, it says this: In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, two great names. It's easy, rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So the chapter opens with grounding the story in actual historical events. This is not some made-up fairy tale. This story is grounded in historical events. In 605 BC, it records the first of a whole range of activities by the Babylonians under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. And then for about a 20-year period, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonian Empire, came and raided and conquered and then enslaved the Jewish southern kingdom of Judah. Now, conquering Judah at first meant deporting the majority of the people away from their homes in Judah to take them to Babylon themselves. Now, being of royal and noble birth, Daniel and his three mates were amongst the first group of these Jews that undertook the 2,700 kilometre journey from Jerusalem to Babylon. These deportations of the Jewish people occurred over 4 instances, and Daniel and his mates were one of the first to go. Now, this presence of the Babylonians in the southern kingdom of Judah ultimately culminated with the walls of Jerusalem being broken down and the destruction of King Solomon's temple in 586 BC. Now, they're historical events, and so this grounds our story in understanding what is going on in the midst of a dramatic change in the social fabric of the Middle East in that particular time. Now, this Babylonian treatment of Judah was something that was of great significance, and it's reflected in verse 1 of the story. And it actually refers to, verse 1, he refers to one of the earlier conquerings, the earlier presence of the Babylonians, not the ones at the end at 586 BC. So in taking some of the articles from the temple in Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar believed that he and his God are now way more powerful than that of the Jews. Now, deporting these Jewish people away from their homes was a declaration of the Babylonian earthly authority. It's saying, look how much power that I have. I can take you away from your homes and send you to a foreign land. But not only that, in taking the temple items, taking the articles from the temple, it was almost like a perceived gloating over the spiritual authority, Babylon's authority over the very spiritual foundations in which set up Israel in the first place. Now, isn't it true, from your experiences, from your observation, that there seems to be an arrogance these days by certain people who almost gloat over when there's this sort of victory over God's people, sort of victory over the church, even some gloating over a perceived victory over the very spiritual foundations which this nation was founded upon? Have you found that there's an arrogance? Have you found that there's a gloating in wider society today about what is going on? I know I have. And it's incredibly troubling. And so as a result of what we're seeing around us, some of us may be exactly like the Jewish people and feel like that this new world order is winning. And some of us have already put up the white flag and go, they've already won. But now, where Nebuchadnezzar believed that it was his own sovereignty, where it was his own power that allowed the victory over the Jews, over Jerusalem and over their gods, the story, even in these first two verses, tell us something very different. The story tells us that, in fact, that God allowed Jerusalem to be conquered, that God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come and conquer Jerusalem. But why would God allow that? Why would God allow his city and his people to be conquered? That's a really good question. See, God delivered Judah into the hands of the Babylonians partly because the Jewish people had totally lost their way. Way back, even before the Babylonians ever came on the scene, when Israel and God were tight, were so close, God said something profound to Moses that's recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And he says to the people, God said to Moses, he said, and then to the people, he's saying, if you stay close to me, everything's going to be great. But if you start forgetting about me, start worshipping other gods, you're going to be sent to all the ends of the earth. You're going to be sent into exile. And so what we're seeing now, a long, long time after Moses, we see this now become a reality. Because the Jewish people had started forgetting about God altogether. The fabric of their society had turned totally away from God to what they only wanted themselves. They'd been doing right in their own eyes. And so they started doing whatever they wanted. And so as God had predicted, as God had forewarned them, he says that if you forget about me, you are going to be sent to the ends of the earth. God's protection around the nation of Israel, around the Jewish people, would be taken off because they'd forgotten about him, allowing foreign nations to come in and take advantage of them. And this now is the consequence. This consequence with the Babylonians coming and taking them away was now the consequence of them losing sight of their God. But it's one thing for God to discipline his people, but it's another to allow God himself to be humiliated in the process. You see, the removal of God's sacred temple items and now being put in the temple of a foreign god appeared nothing short of a humiliation for God. I mean, if God is so powerful, how could he let his precious sacred objects now be put in the temple of another god? See, what we have to realize is that God is prepared to humiliate himself if it furthered his plans for people in this world. And the epitome of this is the crucifixion of Jesus. The cross is nothing short of a humiliation for God, because the crucifixion is not an honourable way to die. Crucifixion is a horrible way to die. There's no good death by being crucified. It was humiliating for whoever got crucified. And God himself was prepared to be executed on a cross, also that the plans of God could be fulfilled. Humiliation brought about something glorious. Humiliation was endured by God to allow his plan for redemption for all people to become a reality. So God is not so proud to say, I'm not going to allow no mud to be flung at me. God says, I'm prepared to have mud flung at me if it allows me to accomplish the plans that I have for this world. So what are the plans then that God has that would see his people be deported to a foreign country? What plans could that possibly be? Well, before it all happened, God actually told the prophet Isaiah what that would be. This is what he told the prophet Isaiah. He says, I will make you a light for the Gentiles. The Gentiles being all the people who are not Jews. They're the Gentiles. I'm going to make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. See, that's God's plans always, that his people were to bring salvation to the ends of the earth, that they're going to know who God is and what it means to live as people who have God as their God, and the benefit and the blessing that comes from doing that. But the people themselves, the Jewish people, weren't doing that voluntarily, so God got them up and forcefully took them to the ends of the earth where this salvation, where this light could come. He would even take them to a land that is foreign, strange, even offensive to them. So be assured, like it was for Daniel, in our world today, we may feel like, or it may be accused that God has left us, that who is this God? Where is this God? But Daniel affirms to the people of this day and to us also, God is not hidden. God hasn't gone anywhere. He is there and he is working. Even when it seems that all hope is lost and everything that's going on in society seems to be working against everything that God has put in our place, that God has put in place. He is God and he is in control. The message of Daniel so far is that God is there and he is in control and he is working out his plan. And what we'll discover is that he works out his plan mostly in people of bold faith. So let's see what happens next in the story to see how that might get played out. From verse 3 then, it goes on, building upon the reality of these first two verses of the significance of what was going on historically. It then says in verse 3, then King Nebuchadnezzar ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego, or Abednego as some people like to call it. Names that are more familiar to us who know the story a little bit more. You know, in my 20 plus years of paid ministry, I've had a few roles. But my first paid ministry role was as a thing called the assimilation pastor. I didn't come up with the title. That was just the title that was made up by the senior pastor at the time. I was the assimilation pastor. And what that meant basically was saying anybody who's new to the church, I was to help them get cared for, get connected, make them feel at home within the church family. Now, that was all good. The execution of the role was really good. But when I started telling people about my title, I started to be getting called Borg. Does anyone know about why I'll be called Borg? The TV show Star Trek Next Generation, there was a race of people called the Borgs, and their primary role was to assimilate everybody to become exactly like them. And they would forcefully indoctrinate and transform people to be exactly like them. And so I started getting the nickname Borg, of all things. Now, in these first few verses here, we start seeing about how Nebuchadnezzar went about assimilating, enculturating, in fact, indoctrinating all the Jewish people who had been transported to Babylon. And we see in these first few verses how he started to do that. First of all, he started to teach them a new language. He started a new language. In other words, they were telling them, this is how we speak around here. You can't use those words anymore, your words. You can't speak in your native tongue anymore. We will give you the words that you have to say, the right words that you are now to say. and you are to talk like us. Then, on building upon the language, it then comes to the issue of literature, writings, policies, procedures, even stories about who they are and about what they do. You know, Jews, your stories, your writings from the past, they are gone. These are the new ways. These are to be your new stories. Does this sound in any way familiar to us today? When it comes to language and when it comes to literature. See, for the Babylonians, their whole literature and their language all revolved around magic and divination and astrology and idolatry, the very things that God had said, people, you are my people, I don't want you to have anything to do with that. But that is the very language, that is the very literature of the whole nation of Babylon, of the whole empire. And if you're going to come into the service of the king, then you are going to have to be involved in that sort of thing, because that is how the society functioned, with magic and divination and astrology. So that's two of the ways they started this indoctrination process. The third then is also with a change of names. Their names were forcibly changed from Jewish names to Babylonian names. The Jewish names of those four guys all reflected the greatness and the character of Yahweh, Israel's one and only God. But Nebuchadnezzar then gave them names which reflected their pagan gods' natures. Now, some of us are very aware, aren't we, of how modern day society is trying to change our names. This is how they're trying to change our names. No longer are you allowed to be known as mother or even father. You're no longer now even known to be known as he or she anymore, but some other name altogether. And if we will not accept the names that society now designates that we have, society then will assign us a different name, a horrible name, and a name that sticks. And that name is bigot. That name is bigot. So the indoctrination process by Nebuchadnezzar with language and literature and names was ultimately to give the Jewish people a completely new identity. No longer were they going to be God's children. They were now going to be citizens of Babylon, children of Babylon. And that's exactly what's happening in today's world as well, where they're trying to change the very identity of Christian people who have their faith in Jesus Christ, where we're no longer God's children, but rather now we are to be good citizens of the New World Order. It's all about being a good citizen, isn't it? They're trying to change the identity of Christian people. So in the face of this assimilation process by Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel then steps up. So in verse 8 it says this, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. And Daniel said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah, 'Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see.'" This then becomes the basis then of the challenge of chapter 1. Could Daniel and his mates not only look better, but actually be healthier by not eating the king's food? So Daniel took his stand for God around the issue of food. Why is that? Well, it brings us into a very, very grey area that may not sit comfortably with many of us. See, you think that when it came to what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to get them to do, it would already be a very black and white situation, because we're talking about language, we're talking about literature, and we're talking about names. I mean, if God had told the Israelites back in Moses' day, "I want you to have nothing to do with magic and divination and all that sort of stuff," why does he make the stand about food? See, what may be a surprise to us is that Daniel and his three mates didn't object to learning about the divination and the magic and all that sort of stuff. In fact, to be part of the coming into the king's service, that is exactly what they have to be a part of. And we know by the last verse of chapter 1 that Daniel actually served the kings for decades. So Daniel himself even allowed himself to come in and surround himself with magic and divination. But he didn't think that that was the sort of stuff that was going to defile him. Rather, it was food, specifically the king's food, that would defile him. And it was upon that then he made his stand. Why is it about food? Not Harry Potter novels. He made a stand about food. Why is that? Some people might think that it has to do with the fact that the food wasn't kosher or that the food was actually offered to idols or something like that, but that's not the case. In fact, Daniel refused to eat the king's food because of a different reason. You see, if you shared the table with the king, if you ate his food, then what that meant was then you are now obligated to support the king politically. No matter what the king's plans or actions may have been, because you shared at his table, because you put your food into his bowl and ate it, then you now have to support him unconditionally in whatever he does. See, refusing the king's food wasn't because of some possible spiritual defilement with the food, but he refused to take the food because of some moral defilement that could have occurred. See, Daniel may learn the culture, he may learn the language and the literature and even accept the new names given to him. But Daniel says, King Nebuchadnezzar, I want you to know that I will not do anything that tells you that I will support you unconditionally, that I will support you blindly in whatever you think is right. Whatever it is that you choose to do, I am not going to support you in that. And I'm not going to do anything that gives you the impression that you have my support, my unconditional support. So translating for that for us today is this. How is your world try to get your blind support for their ways? Have you even thought about it before? How is your world trying to get your blind, unconditional support for whatever it is that they do? Do we even have eyes to even ask the question? Now, from chapter 1, Daniel is not telling us. Daniel is not giving us permission now for us to go and read our horoscopes in the Daily Telegraph or to contact our clairvoyant on mediums.com. Mediums are us, or I don't know if that's real or not. I'm sure someone's got the domain name out there. Daniel's not giving us permission to do that simply because he learnt about all that sort of stuff back in Babylonia. Nor is what happens in chapter 1 a prescription of what we are to do in our situation, where we go, oh no, I can't go and have a kebab just in case it's made by a Muslim person. What happens in chapter 1 is that it introduces a concept, a theme that sees throughout the entire book. And the theme is this: where is the line that I will draw on what I will and will not do? Where is the line? Now, interestingly, because of Daniel's bold faith about the refusal of the food, this was the result. From verse 15, it says, at the end of the 10 days, these 4 guys looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who ate the royal food. And so to these 4 young men, God gave the knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. See, because of their bold faith stand for God, the God that then blessed them with the ability to understand the good and the bad parts of society. Not all things were bad, but rather they could now discern the good and the bad in the society that they were placed. Now, Edwina's going to be talking about next week about how that blessing of that knowledge and that insight that they got from God was allowed to be used for God's glory in an incredible situation. See, discerning what's happening in our world right now takes incredible wisdom. It's so easy to get confused and manipulated by what is happening right now. But have you even asked God for the wisdom to know what is good and what is bad in our society? Or are you the type of person that says anything that appears to be anti-Christian, I'm going to get my buck up about that? I'm just going to complain to anybody who will listen. Oh, it's just not like the good old days anymore. Things have changed so much. See, for us, we have to discern the good and the bad in what is happening in society. So much change that's happening in our world today is actually good. But some of us is troubling equally. But God gave wisdom to Daniel and his three mates, and God can give you wisdom that as well. Jesus' brother James in the New Testament writes, if you lack wisdom, ask God and he will give it to you. We need to ask God for wisdom about knowing how to discern our current times. And this wisdom will help us immeasurably. I mean, it'll even help us to understand how to respond with situations like Andrew Thornburg and Essendon Club situation. Now, for me personally, I am deeply, deeply saddened on how Mr. Thornburg was treated as a Christian. But there's a flip side to that as well. You see, if society jumped up and down about the fact that Mr. Thornburg had traditional Christian values around the issues of abortion and sexuality, and their values don't align, so you can't serve in that particular way, that is an encouragement to me, because what that says, it still allows then Christian schools and Christian charities and even churches to be able to employ people who align their values with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It gives me great encouragement saying that that can still occur, because there's a section of society these days who are trying to remove any opportunities for Christian people to appoint, called Christian organisations to appoint Christian people. But as long as the Essendon type situation goes on, we can still appoint people who align with our values, our traditional Christian values. Now, although Mr. Thornburg was professionally executed at the hands of these new Babylonian rulers, the likes of Daniel Andrews, what we have already seen in chapter 1 already of Daniel, but then when we have a look at other biblical characters like Joseph and Moses and Esther, who find themselves in very similar social settings where their world is turned upside down, we see ultimately that God raises up people, incredible people, to impact the world, to be light and to bring God's salvation to the ends of the world. God will raise up people into positions of influence, regardless of what they believe, to see his plans come about into this world. And right now, you could be strategically positioned by God to even have more an impact on this world than even Daniel had. God has you strategically positioned in your world for a reason. And that is to be his light and to bring his salvation, even in a world that is so dark. We are not in Kansas anymore, but we also take great encouragement that God is with us as he was with Daniel and his three mates. We are not alone. God is always with us. You know, what we see from Daniel chapter 1, though, is that, and it's rather troubling for us when we think about it, is that we may find that people of faith have their line drawn at a different place to us. And our tendency is to judge them for it. Oh, you can't be a Christian if that's where your line is, because your line has to be here with us, where we are. Daniel's line may be very different to where we would have drawn the line if we were in the same place. The Maccabees, in the pre-Jesus times, they would have been totally offended the fact that Daniel didn't stand up and reject the teaching of the Babylonians. They would have been appalled at that. But yet what we learn about this chapter is that our lines may be in different places, but it doesn't mean we have any less faith in God. The issue is ultimately, where is the line? And guarantee, if you are a follower of Jesus, there needs to be a line drawn of where you stand up for God. So for each of us, it's about asking God this. This could be a prayer that you might want to pray to God. The prayer could go something like this: God, in this confusing world and considering where you have placed me, where do you want my line to be? God, I want to honour you above all things. Jesus, you are my Lord and I live for you. So I ask for wisdom about where my line for you is to be. I wonder how many of us even ask God the question about where he wants our line to be, of where we are to stand up for him, that where we are to make our stand. Do you even ask God where that is, or do you just go with the flow and just see where he ends up? You see, a lot of times we won't make our stand for God because we are concerned above all things. The greatest concern for us is not where we stand for God. Our greatest concern is our comfort and our safety. But what we have to recognise is saying the line of where you stand for God is not for your comfort and your safety, as we will see in the coming chapters of Daniel, but rather the line that we stand on for God is for his plans and for his glory. The line that Daniel stood on was for the plans of God and for his glory. And the thing that epitomizes people of bold faith is that they understand that what they stand on is not for their comfort and their safety, but it is for the plans of God becoming a reality in this world. Where is that line for you? Upon which do you need to stand today? It may be different for all of us, but it all comes from us asking our Lord Jesus, where do you want me to stand for you, considering where you have placed me to be? It may look very different, but if our hearts are attuned to Jesus, then that'll become clear, and we can stand boldly in the faith that we have in him. This is an interesting chapter, chapter 1, and it may not be what we expect, but it encourages us nonetheless to have bold faith to stand where we need to and in ways that we may not expect. Where is that for you today? Where is that for you today? For some of us here today, we have not even put our faith in Jesus before, that we have not even drawn the line and saying, I'm stepping over the line and coming into your kingdom, God, where I'm going to accept Jesus as my Lord and Saviour. If that's you today and you know that you haven't made that faith step today, then maybe that is a day, today is a day of salvation for you, where you make your stand on the reality of Jesus, him dying on the cross for you and his resurrection. Maybe today is a day when you make that stand for Jesus. For others of us, today we know that we have to make a stand in our world because they're trying to change our very identity. But we know now today, building upon the example of Daniel and his mates, that we need to make a stand. And we need to be bold in our faith in God. If that's you today, then I hope that you will stand to do so.